The message arrived without ceremony. Just another signal pushed through the endless current of wartime reports. Yet its implications were explosive. In less than 48 hours, George Patton's Third Army had advanced far beyond its assigned operational boundary. What had been conceived as a measured exploitation had become a headlong surge. Staff officers stared at situation maps that were already outdated. Lines drawn carefully in blue grease pencil no longer matched reality. The plan had not collapsed. It had been outrun, and at Supreme Headquarters, that distinction mattered more than anyone outside the command tent could understand. The Allied advance across France had been designed as a synchronized machine. Every movement depended on another. Infantry securing flanks, engineers repairing bridges, fuel convoys threading fragile supply corridors, stretching back to the Normandy beaches. It was not simply an American operation. British formations anchored one sector. Canadian divisions guarded another. Air power operated on coordinated schedules. The success of the coalition depended on timing, restraint, and balance. Speed was desirable, but predictability was essential. Patton's sudden acceleration threatened to tilt that equilibrium, not through failure, but through excessive success. Reports from the front described armored columns pushing east with startling momentum. German rearguards dissolved before sustained contact. Road junctions fell intact. Fuel dumps were captured rather than destroyed. In operational terms, it was a commander's dream enemy. Cohesion unraveling faster than anticipated. Yet success created exposure. Every mile gained stretched, supply lines thinner. Every river crossed widened the gap between spearhead and support. The breakthrough was real, but so was the vacuum forming along its flanks. Momentum had become both weapon and liability. Inside the headquarters, the maps told a story of divergence. The main Allied front advanced methodically, consolidating each gain before pressing onward. Patton's forces, by contrast, appeared as a sharp protrusion, a spear extending deep into contested territory. The visual contrast was impossible to ignore. One approach emphasized cohesion. The other emphasized shock. Neither was inherently wrong. But the plan had not envisioned a single army racing so far ahead of its neighbors. Coalition warfare demanded coordination, not individual brilliance. Dwight Eisenhower understood that tension better than anyone in the room. As Supreme Commander, his authority was not merely military. It was diplomatic. He balanced personalities as carefully as divisions. British leadership expected consultation. American generals demanded latitude. Every operational decision carried political weight. When he read the latest report detailing Patton's rapid advance, the issue was not whether it was impressive. It was whether it was sustainable. Victory gained too quickly, without coordination, could fracture the unity that made victory possible. The words attributed to him that wasn't the plan were not an outburst. They were an assessment. Plans exist to prevent chaos. They impose rhythm on violence. They align resources with objectives. Yet war rarely obeys diagrams. Patton had always believed that hesitation invited resistance. If the enemy was collapsing, he would not pause to measure alignment with adjacent commands. He would exploit. Eisenhower, however, measured success in broader terms. A breakthrough that endangered coalition balance risked strategic instability, even if tactically brilliant. At the operational level, the breakthrough revealed genuine opportunity. German command structures in the sector were fragmented. Units retreated without coherent lines of defense. Communications faltered under relentless pressure. Patton's forward elements reported minimal organized resistance. Such conditions seldom lasted. A disciplined enemy could reconstitute quickly if given time. The temptation to press relentlessly was understandable. The danger lay in assuming collapse equaled defeat. History repeatedly demonstrated that armies under strain often hardened rather than disintegrated. Fuel columns struggled to keep pace with armored thrusts that consumed gasoline at astonishing rates. Maintenance crews worked without pause, replacing worn tracks and repairing overtaxed engines. Artillery units advanced faster than their supply allocations anticipated. The breakthrough appeared effortless from afar. Up close, it was a gamble sustained by exhaustion and improvisation. Every mile forward depended on fragile systems operating beyond their design capacity. If those systems faltered, speed would transform into vulnerability. Eisenhower's dilemma was not whether to reward initiative or punish disobedience. It was whether to preserve momentum or enforce structure. The breakthrough posed a fundamental question about modern warfare. Does victory belong to the commander who adheres to the plan, or to the one who recognizes when the plan has become obsolete? The answer was rarely absolute. Coalition warfare amplified that complexity. Too much independence risked fragmentation. Too much control risked stagnation. Somewhere between them lay equilibrium. As night settled over the headquarters, the maps were updated again. The protrusion extended farther east. Success was undeniable. So was the uncertainty it created. The breakthrough had achieved what weeks of grinding combat sought to accomplish. Yet it had also exposed the fragile architecture holding the Allied advance together. The plan had been written for measured advance. Reality had delivered something else entirely. The coming hours would determine whether that divergence marked decisive victory or the beginning of dangerous overreach. Long before Patton's columns accelerated across the French countryside, the Allied advance had been reduced to a set of deliberate calculations. The blueprint was not improvised in the heat of momentum. It was drafted in conference rooms, thick with cigarette smoke, argued over by British and American planners who understood that coalition war demanded structure before speed. The objective was clear: break out from Normandy, drive east, maintain pressure, and prevent the German army from re-establishing a coherent defensive line. But how that objective would be achieved was carefully bounded by logistics, diplomacy, and hard lessons from previous campaigns. The Normandy landings had demonstrated that overwhelming force could secure a foothold. What followed demonstrated something else entirely: that sustaining that foothold required patience. The hedgerows had slowed armored maneuver to a crawl. Supply depots struggled to keep pace with advancing divisions. Artillery ammunition consumption exceeded projections. Air superiority masked friction, but could not eliminate it. The planners who crafted the post-breakout advance understood that initial success could not justify The Allied army in France was vast, but it was not invulnerable. At the center of the blueprint was synchronization. American armies were to advance along coordinated axes while British and Canadian formations secured the northern flank. Ports would be opened in sequence to ease the immense burden on the Normandy beaches. Rail lines would be restored to push fuel and ammunition forward efficiently. The plan valued cohesion over spectacle. It assumed resistance would stiffen as German units withdrew to our defensible terrain. The intention was not to outrun the enemy, but to compress him steadily until organized resistance collapsed under sustained pressure. Logistics dictated every decision. A single armored division could consume hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel in days of continuous movement. Artillery shells moved forward by truck convoys, vulnerable to ambush and breakdown. Bridges destroyed by retreating forces had to be rebuilt before heavy equipment could cross. Every mile gained extended the supply chain farther from the Channel coast. Speed magnified strain. The blueprint therefore emphasized phased exploitation: advance, consolidate, resupply, and then advance again. Coalition politics added another layer of constraint. British commanders, still mindful of heavy casualties earlier in the campaign, preferred measured operations designed to preserve strength. American commanders, buoyed by industrial capacity and growing battlefield confidence, leaned toward aggressive maneuver. Eisenhower stood between these philosophies. His role was not merely to win territory, but to ensure that victory did not fracture Allied unity. A breakthrough achieved by one army at the expense of coordination risked more than exposed flanks. It risked diplomatic friction at the highest levels. Intelligence assessments further reinforced caution. German forces, though battered, retained experienced officers and hardened units capable of counterattack. History offered repeated examples of armies appearing shattered only to reconstitute rapidly once supply lines stabilized. The blueprint therefore treated German withdrawal as tactical repositioning rather than collapse. Planners assumed resistance would intensify as the Allies approached fortified natural barriers, major rivers, urban strongholds, and prepared defensive belts. Air power was integrated tightly into this design. Fighter bombers were assigned to disrupt German reinforcements and interdict supply routes. Heavy bombers targeted rail junctions beyond the immediate front. Yet air operations depended on weather and coordination. Advancing too rapidly could outpace air cover schedules and complicate identification of friendly units. The blueprint accounted for this by linking ground thrusts to predictable air support windows. Mobility was encouraged, but it was choreographed. Even the psychological dimension was considered. Allied commanders sought to maintain steady pressure without overextending into vulnerable sailing. A unified front projected inevitability. A protruding spearhead invited concentration. The memory of earlier campaigns where ambitious thrusts outran their support and suffered sharp reversals lingered in planning discussions. Stability was not timidity. It was insurance against overconfidence. Against this framework, Patton's philosophy of relentless exploitation existed as a controlled variable. His army was expected to move aggressively when conditions permitted, but within defined limits. The blueprint allowed initiative, yet bounded it by coordination requirements. Every army group depended on adjacent formations securing flanks. Every breakthrough was meant to be shared, not isolated. Success was to unfold across the entire front, preventing the enemy from concentrating force against any single penetration. Thus, the plan Eisenhower referenced was more than a set of arrows on a map. It was an agreement between allies, between services, between doctrine and reality. It reflected the belief that modern warfare, fought by massive coalitions across vast terrain, could not rely solely on brilliance at the point of contact. It required discipline at scale. Patton's 48-hour surge did not violate the objective. It violated the rhythm, and in coalition warfare, rhythm often determines whether momentum becomes victory or vulnerability. George Patton did not believe in slow victory. To him, war was not a contest of endurance but of shock. An enemy force backward should never be given time to breathe. A retreating force was not stabilizing, it was unraveling. Where others saw boundaries on a map, Patton saw hesitation. And hesitation, in his view, was the one unforgivable sin in mobile warfare. The 48-hour surge that startled Supreme Headquarters was not a spontaneous act of defiance. It was the logical extension of a philosophy he had carried since North Africa. Speed was not recklessness. Speed was protection. Patton's operational creed rested on a simple contrast movement versus paralysis. An advancing army dictated tempo. A stationary army reacted. He understood that modern mechanized warfare had altered the psychology of combat. Tanks, motorized infantry, and close air support could collapse defensive cohesion before traditional lines were formed. Shock did not merely destroy units, it destroyed confidence. Once doubt spread through command networks, resistance fractured. In that environment, a pause was more dangerous than a push. Every hour spent consolidating was an hour the enemy used to reorganize. This belief was reinforced by experience. In Sicily, rapid maneuver had outflanked German defenses and forced withdrawals that might otherwise have hardened into prolonged battles. In France, after the breakout from Normandy, Patton witnessed how quickly German formations disintegrated when pressed without mercy. Rear guards fought stubbornly, but they were fragments, not cohesive armies. He interpreted these collapses not as isolated events, but as evidence that German operational stability depended on time. Remove time, and the structure crumbled. Eisenhower's worldview, by contrast, emphasized equilibrium. He measured progress across the entire front, not at its sharpest edge. Patton measured opportunity at the point of contact. Eisenhower's concern was sustainability. Patton's was exploitation. Neither approach was inherently superior. The tension arose because both were necessary. An army that advanced recklessly could outrun support. An army that advanced too cautiously might forfeit decisive advantage. The conflict between plan and impulse was not personal rivalry. It was doctrinal friction. Patton also believed deeply in the morale effect of momentum. Soldiers moving forward felt dominant. They perceived themselves as unstoppable. Logistics officers complained about fuel consumption. Patton countered that fuel was meant to be burned. Machines deteriorated. They could be replaced. What could not be replaced was psychological superiority. If his troops believed they were driving the enemy relentlessly, their aggressiveness multiplied. He fostered that belief deliberately. He demanded discipline, but he celebrated boldness. To his subordinates, caution often appeared as doubt. Yet relentless motion carried inherent risk. Rapid advances created elongated supply corridors vulnerable to disruption. Fuel shortages could immobilize spearheads at critical moments. Maintenance crews struggled to service engines operating continuously across rough terrain. Patton accepted these hazards as the price of dominance. In his calculus, Temporary exposure was preferable to strategic stagnation. He calculated that a shocked enemy would lack the coordination to exploit Allied vulnerability quickly enough. There was also an intellectual dimension to his thinking. Patton studied history obsessively. He admired commanders who seized fleeting opportunities and despised those who hesitated into a rush. To him, the battlefield was a fluid environment where initiative determined destiny. Plans were necessary starting points, but they were not sacred documents. Once combat revealed unexpected weakness, adjustment was mandatory. The rigid adherence to a pre-written schedule seemed, in his view, a surrender to bureaucracy rather than adaptation to reality. The 48-hour breakthrough, therefore, did not represent rebellion. It represented opportunity recognized and exploited. German forces in his sector were retreating under pressure. Communications, intercepts, and reconnaissance reports suggested confusion. If Third Army paused to align perfectly with adjacent formations, that confusion might solidify into defense. Patton saw momentum as perishable. Delay risked forfeiture. His decision to surge forward reflected his core assumption that initiative was a weapon, and like any weapon, it must be used decisively. This philosophy created both admiration and unease within the Allied command structure. Subordinate commanders often found clarity in Patton's intent. There was no ambiguity: advance, exploit, press. Yet higher headquarters faced a broader horizon. They saw adjacent sectors, coalition commitments, and supply forecasts. Patton saw collapsing resistance in front of him. The difference in perspective: magnified doctrinal tension, relentless motion, then, was not merely aggression. It was a theory of warfare grounded in tempo. Patton believed that speed compressed enemy decision-making cycles, forcing mistakes. Eisenhower believed that coordination prevented Allied mistakes. Both recognized the cost of error. The breakthrough that broke the plan emerged from this collision of principles. One man trusted velocity to secure victory. The other trusted structure to preserve it. Between those two philosophies lay the fragile balance of modern coalition war. The breakthrough did not begin with a dramatic explosion or a single decisive engagement. It began with absence of resistance, where resistance had been expected. Reconnaissance units probing ahead of Third Army's main columns reported thin German screens, abandoned positions, and artillery pieces left behind without crews. Bridges that intelligence analysts assumed would be destroyed were found intact. Road junctions that should have been defended were deserted. The front was not collapsing everywhere, but in Patton's sector it was thinning faster than anyone at higher headquarters had predicted. Once the initial defensive crust cracked, movement accelerated almost organically. Armored spearheads rolled forward along multiple roads, bypassing pockets of resistance rather than halting to eliminate them. Infantry followed in trucks, securing towns already taken by tanks hours earlier. Engineers worked at a sprint, reinforcing bridges and clearing mines with minimal delay. The advance ceased to resemble a textbook operation and began to look like pursuit. And pursuit, in mobile warfare, is a different animal entirely. It feeds on disarray. German rearguards attempted to delay the momentum with scattered anti-tank guns and localized ambushes. In some villages, small groups of defenders fought stubbornly, forcing American units to deploy artillery or close air support. Yet these actions lacked coordination. They were fragments of a larger defensive system that had not yet reassembled. Every time resistance stiffened, it was flanked or overwhelmed before it could anchor into something stable. Patton's commanders interpreted this pattern as confirmation. The enemy was reacting, not dictating. The tempo increased. Tanks refueled from hastily, established forward depots, and immediately resumed movement. Drivers pushed engines to their limits, aware that speed was the shield protecting them. Radio traffic surged with reports of captured supply dumps and prisoners taken by the hundreds. German convoys retreating east were intercepted and destroyed before they could reorganize. In operational terms, the breakthrough became exploitation movement beyond the rupture, into the depth of enemy lines. Maps at Corps headquarters struggled to keep pace. Units reported positions that exceeded planned daily objectives by wide margins. Phase lines drawn as cautious benchmarks were crossed hours after dawn. Staff officers recalculated distances and timelines repeatedly, only to see them rendered obsolete by dusk. The disparity between expectation and reality widened. The plan had envisioned a measured extension of pressure. Instead, Third Army was carving a salient into German-held territory at a speed that alarmed logistical planners. Fuel became both enabler and constraint. Tank columns consumed gasoline at a staggering rate, and supply convoys labored to close the widening gap between beachhead depots and forward units. Drivers worked through the night, navigating narrow French roads choked with refugees and wreckage. Every additional mile gained by the spearhead lengthened the vulnerable artery feeding it. Yet as long as the fuel arrived, momentum continued. Patton's calculation held. A disorganized enemy could not exploit exposed supply lines quickly enough to matter. Terrain played its part. Open stretches of countryside favored armored thrusts, while river crossings posed momentary choke points. Engineers often reached bridges just hours before German demolition teams could destroy them. In several cases, rapid infantry pushes secured crossing sites in dramatic fashion, preserving routes that would otherwise have stalled the advance. Each intact bridge multiplied speed. Each destroyed bridge threatened delay. Fortune, preparation, and audacity intersected repeatedly during those 48 hours. Air support amplified the effect. Fighter bombers ranged ahead of the advancing columns, striking retreating vehicles and disrupting attempts at regrouping. German units attempting to form defensive lines found themselves under attack before positions could be fortified. The psychological impact was cumulative. Reports from prisoners described confusion at multiple command levels. Orders issued in the morning were irrelevant by afternoon. The perception of an unstoppable surge spread faster than the tanks themselves. Yet beneath the surface of triumph lay fragility. Flanks grew thinner as forward elements pushed beyond adjacent formations. Some units advanced so rapidly that contact with neighboring armies became intermittent. Coordination with British forces to the north lagged behind the pace of movement. What appeared as decisive penetration on one map resembled protrusion on another. The deeper the spear drove, the more it depended on speed to mask its vulnerability. Within the ranks of Third Army, exhilaration mixed with exhaustion. Soldiers sensed they were part of something historic, a chase rather than a siege. Captured German equipment littered the roadsides. Towns fell with minimal resistance, greeted by civilians who scarcely believed the front had shifted so abruptly. Yet maintenance crews worked without pause to keep vehicles operational. Tracks wore thin, engines overheated. Artillery units strained to reposition guns across rapidly shifting lines. By the end of the second day, the numbers spoke clearly. Third Army had advanced distances that the original operational schedule assigned for nearly a week. The breakthrough was no longer a localized exploitation. It was a transformation of the front's geometry. German commanders were forced into hurried withdrawals, attempting to establish defensive coherence farther east. Patton's gamble on momentum appeared vindicated. The enemy had not stabilized. He had retreated. But every mile gained deepened the central tension. The spearhead extended farther from the stabilizing weight of the broader Allied line. The success was undeniable, yet it demanded recalibration at every level of command. The 48-hour surge was not merely a battlefield episode. It was a strategic divergence unfolding in real time. Victory and vulnerability advanced together, inseparable, racing eastward at the speed of tanks. At Supreme Headquarters, the tone was different. There was no roar of engines, no dust rising from armored columns. There were only maps, reports, and calculations. And those calculations were beginning to contradict each other. The situation summaries arriving from Third Army were impressive, even exhilarating. Distances covered exceeded projections. German units were falling back in disorder, yet the operational overlay told another story. Patton's spearhead was no longer aligned with the synchronized tempo envisioned in the Allied blueprint. It was ahead, significantly ahead. Eisenhower read the field reports without visible emotion. He had long understood Patton's temperament. Speed was expected. Bold exploitation was not a surprise. What concerned him was scale. A local surge could be corrected. A deep, rapidly expanding penetration altered the geometry of the entire front. Adjacent armies had not moved at comparable velocity. Supply projections had not been recalibrated for sustained acceleration. Coordination with British command required careful timing. Coalition warfare did not reward unilateral brilliance if it disrupted collective stability. Logistics officers were the first to voice alarm. Fuel consumption reports were staggering. Truck convoys were already stretched thin across extended routes from the Normandy beaches. Rail lines were only partially restored. Each additional mile of advance increased turnaround times for resupply. A breakthrough was valuable only if it could be sustained. Otherwise, momentum risked turning into immobility at the worst possible moment. An armored column, halted for lack of fuel, became a fixed target rather than a weapon. Intelligence assessments were equally cautious. German forces in retreat were not the same as German forces defeated. Reports indicated that several experienced panzer divisions were regrouping beyond the immediate breakthrough zone. If those formations concentrated against the exposed flanks of Third Army's protrusion, the consequences could be severe. Rapid penetration invited counterstroke. History offered examples of bold advances reversed by disciplined counterattacks against overextended spearheads. Eisenhower could not ignore that precedent. British commanders, observing developments from their sector, expressed measured concern. The Allied campaign was not a contest between individual American armies, but a coordinated multinational effort. A dramatic American surge that outran British positions risked creating operational imbalance. While there was no formal objection to Patton's aggressiveness, the political implications were delicate. Eisenhower's responsibility extended beyond battlefield success. He managed alliance cohesion as carefully as troop deployments. The phrase attributed to him, "That wasn't the plan," captured this layered anxiety. It was not a reprimand rooted in jealousy or distrust. It was recognition that war, especially coalition war, required structure. Plans were not rigid for their own sake. They preserved predictability across vast, interconnected systems. When one element accelerated unexpectedly, the entire structure shifted. Eisenhower's reaction reflected awareness that victory achieved without coordination could generate vulnerabilities more dangerous than delay. Inside headquarters, staff officers recalculated phase lines and objectives. Communication channels buzzed with requests for updated position confirmations. Air support schedules were reviewed to ensure coverage extended to the new forward boundaries. Artillery allocations were adjusted, yet each adjustment underscored the same reality. The breakthrough had forced strategic recalibration rather than fitting within existing parameters. Patton's momentum had created opportunity, but it had also imposed complexity. There was also an unspoken tension regarding authority. Patton was subordinate to the broader operational framework, yet his initiative had yielded tangible gains. To restrain him prematurely risked dampening momentum. To allow unrestricted continuation risked strategic imbalance. Eisenhower's leadership style favored balance rather than spectacle. He valued commanders who acted decisively, but he valued unity more. The challenge lay in harnessing Patton's velocity without permitting it to fracture the coordinated advance. Reports from the front continued to arrive, each confirming that German resistance in the sector remained fragmented. The immediate tactical picture supported Patton's judgment, yet Eisenhower's vantage point was wider. He considered not just the next 24 hours, but the coming weeks' river crossings, supply sustainability, the approach to fortified lines deeper inside France and toward Germany itself. A breakthrough was meaningful only if it advanced the entire coalition front, not just one army's position. Thus, the shock at headquarters was not panic. It was strategic recalculation under pressure. The maps displayed success in bold strokes, but they also revealed thin lines along the flanks. The plan had been constructed to distribute risk evenly across the front. The 48-hour surge concentrated both glory and danger into a single protrusion. Eisenhower recognized that momentum and exposure were advancing together. The question confronting him was not whether Patton had succeeded. It was whether that success could be integrated before it produced consequences beyond control. The news did not explode inside Supreme Headquarters. It accumulated. A map marker pushed east, then another, then another. By the time staff officers fully grasped the scale of Patton's advance, the geometry of the front had changed. What had been a coordinated line stretching across France now featured a sharp protrusion, an American spear thrust far beyond its neighbors. It was not chaos. It was success, and that distinction made the moment more complicated, not less. Dwight Eisenhower's command style was deliberate. He did not equate speed with wisdom, nor caution with weakness. His responsibility extended beyond battlefield triumph. He commanded a coalition American, British, Canadian, and other siege, with political sensitivities and strategic priorities. The Allied advance was designed as a synchronized machine. When one component accelerated beyond the others, The machine did not automatically become stronger. It became stressed. The initial reports from Third Army were undeniably impressive. German resistance in the sector appeared fractured. Road junctions had fallen rapidly. Prisoners were taken in large numbers. Fuel depots had been captured intact. Yet for every tactical success listed, a second line of data demanded attention: fuel consumption rates, ammunition expenditure, distance from established depots, exposure of flanks. War at the front rewarded aggression. War at the theater level demanded balance. Logistics officers were among the first to express concern. The Allied supply system in France remained fragile. Major ports were not yet fully operational. The vast majority of fuel and ammunition still flowed from Normandy beaches through congested road networks. Every mile Patton gained lengthened the supply corridor. Convoys required more time to travel forward and return. Vehicle wear increased. Maintenance cycles shortened. Speed magnified strain across the entire logistical architecture. Eisenhower understood that momentum could conceal fragility. An armored column moving rapidly appeared unstoppable. An armored column halted for lack of fuel became a liability. The difference between those two states could hinge on a single disrupted supply line. If German forces regrouped and targeted Third Army's elongated flank, the consequences could extend beyond a stalled advance. The entire Allied front might need to divert resources to stabilize the protrusion. British commanders observed the surge with measured apprehension. They were advancing more methodically to the north, consolidating positions and ensuring secure flanks. Patton's acceleration risked creating asymmetry. Coalition warfare depended on unity of effort. A dramatic American breakthrough that outran British formations could generate political friction, even if unintentionally. Eisenhower was acutely aware that victory must be shared to preserve alliance cohesion. The phrase attributed to him, "That wasn't the plan," reflected structural concern rather than emotional reaction. The plan had been designed to apply steady, distributed pressure across the German front. Patton's maneuver concentrated pressure in a single deep thrust. Concentration could yield decisive results. It could also invite counterstroke. German doctrine historically favored rapid reconstitution and localized counterattacks. An exposed salient presented opportunity to an enemy capable of swift redeployment. Intelligence assessments reinforced caution. Intercepts and reconnaissance suggested that German units farther east were attempting to regroup behind natural defensive lines. Rivers, urban centers, and forested terrain offered defensive potential. If Patton's spearhead reached such obstacles without adequate support, it could find itself confronting organized resistance, while flanks remained vulnerable. Tactical success in open terrain did not guarantee similar momentum against prepared defenses. Inside headquarters, recalibration began. Air support schedules were reviewed to ensure coverage extended to new forward positions. Artillery allocations were adjusted. Supply offices recalculated projected fuel requirements for sustained operations at increased tempo. The administrative machinery of theater command responded quickly, yet each adjustment underscored a simple truth. The breakthrough had outpaced coordination. Eisenhower faced a delicate choice. To restrain Patton immediately might sacrifice momentum and risk allowing German forces to stabilize. To endorse unrestricted continuation risked His leadership philosophy emphasized controlled exploitation, advance aggressively when opportunity presented itself, but preserve cohesion. He valued Patton's aggressiveness, but he valued theater-wide stability more. There was also the matter of precedent. If one army exceeded operational boundaries without consequence, others might interpret initiative as license. Discipline within coalition command structures relied on clear adherence to agreed frameworks. Eisenhower could not permit the perception that plans were optional. Yet neither could he ignore tangible success on the ground. Reports continued to confirm that German forces in Patton's sector remained disorganized. For the moment, the gamble appeared to be paying dividends. But theater command operated on longer horizons. Eisenhower's perspective encompassed weeks ahead of her. Crossings yet to be secured. Fortified lines nearer to Germany. Political implications of rapid territorial shifts. War was not won in isolated bursts of brilliance. It was won through sustained, coordinated pressure. The shock at Supreme Headquarters was therefore intellectual, not emotional. It was the recognition that the campaign had entered a new phase unexpectedly. The front was no longer symmetrical. The plan required adaptation. The breakthrough forced strategic recalibration under pressure, demanding integration rather than reprimand. Patton had demonstrated what relentless momentum could achieve. Eisenhower now faced the harder task, ensuring that momentum strengthened the coalition rather than destabilized it. Success, when it arrives too quickly, carries its own risks. The spear had pierced deep. The question confronting Supreme Headquarters was whether it could be reinforced before the enemy found its exposed edges. Triumph on the map often conceals tension beneath the surface. Patton's 48-hour surge looked decisive from a distance, a clean arrow driven deep into collapsing enemy territory. But beneath that arrow lay a web of vulnerability that expanded with every mile gained. The very speed that had shattered German cohesion now threatened to outrun the systems sustaining it. Glory moved forward at full throttle. Risk moved with it. The first strain appeared in fuel reports. Armored divisions consumed gasoline at astonishing rates during continuous movement. Tanks were not designed for symbolic advances. They were built for sustained combat. And sustained combat demanded constant supply. Fuel trucks struggled to maintain contact with spearheads that had advanced far beyond projected phase lines. Each refueling operation required coordination, security, and time. Without uninterrupted flow, even the most aggressive maneuver would halt abruptly. Supply lines stretched thin across vulnerable terrain. The roads feeding Third Army were narrow, often damaged, and crowded with civilian refugees, damaged vehicles, and military convoys moving in both directions. Engineers repaired bridges at remarkable speed, yet each intact crossing represented a potential choke point. A single well-placed German counterattack against these arteries could sever the lifeline feeding the breakthrough. Momentum masked fragility, but it did not eliminate it. Exposed flanks compounded the danger. As Third Army pushed forward, adjacent formations could not match the pace immediately. This created open corridors on either side of the protrusion territory, not fully secured but now lying behind advancing American columns. German units bypassed during the surge were not necessarily destroyed. Some withdrew in disorder, but others regrouped in forests, villages, and defensive terrain. A spearhead advancing too rapidly risked leaving active resistance in its wake. Intelligence officers warned that German command structures, though shaken, were not irreparably broken. Veteran officers retained the capacity to reorganize fragmented units into coherent defensive lines. History showed that armies under pressure often stiffened when cornered. If German forces consolidated against the exposed sides of Patton's advance, the protrusion could transform from offensive thrust to liability. The deeper it extended, the harder it would be to protect. Weather introduced another variable. Allied air superiority had magnified the effectiveness of the breakthrough, disrupting German attempts to regroup. Yet air operations were never guaranteed. Fog, rain, or low cloud cover could ground fighter bombers and remove a critical layer of protection. If ground forces advanced beyond artillery range and without reliable air cover, they would rely solely on organic support. Speed could not substitute indefinitely for firepower coordination. Maintenance pressures intensified as well. Tanks operating continuously across rough terrain accumulated mechanical strain. Tracks wore thin. Engines overheated. Artillery pieces required recalibration after rapid displacement. The illusion of unstoppable motion depended on relentless repair efforts behind the scenes. Each breakdown reduced available strength at the front. If breakdown rates outpaced replacement capacity, momentum would erode gradually rather than collapse dramatically. There was also the human dimension. Infantry riding atop armored vehicles experienced exhaustion that statistics did not capture. Drivers operated with minimal sleep. Commanders made rapid decisions under compressed timelines. Rapid exploitation rewarded boldness, but it punished miscalculation. A misread crossroads or unscouted village could conceal anti-tank guns positioned to exploit overconfidence. Speed narrowed the margin for error. Strategically, the greatest risk lay in assumption. Success in open countryside did not guarantee similar results against prepared defensive terrain. Rivers, fortified towns, and elevated ground offered natural anchors for German reorganization. If Patton's spearhead reached such terrain without synchronized reinforcement, the tempo advantage might evaporate. A halted salient became a fixed front, vulnerable to concentrated enemy action from multiple directions. Eisenhower's concern was not that Patton had advanced too far tactically. It was that the advance required integration at theater level before it produced unintended consequences. Coalition warfare depended on mutual reinforcement. An isolated surge, however brilliant, risked distorting the balance that made sustained victory possible. The breakthrough needed flanks secured, supply corridors reinforced, and adjacent formations repositioned to support its new depth. Yet the paradox remained. Too slow prematurely could invite the enemy to stabilize. To continue without adjustment invited overextension. The risk behind the glory was therefore dynamic, not static. It evolved hour by hour. Each report of additional ground gained intensified both promise and exposure. The spear drove deeper. Its edges grew thinner. Patton calculated that the enemy's disarray would prevent effective counteraction before integration occurred. Eisenhower calculated that the enemy's resilience could not be dismissed. Between those two assessments lay the uncertainty that defines war. The 48-hour breakthrough had demonstrated the power of relentless motion. Section by section, the campaign now revealed the price of sustaining it. Victory on the battlefield is rarely absolute. It carries within it the seeds of vulnerability. As Third Army pressed forward, the question was no longer whether momentum could be achieved. It was whether momentum could be protected long enough to transform opportunity. Shock is powerful, but it is rarely permanent. The initial German reaction to Patton's surge was disorientation, fragmented withdrawals, abandoned positions, hurried demolition. Yet within hours of recognizing the depth of the penetration, German command began the process it had executed repeatedly throughout the war. Consolidation under pressure. Retreat did not signify surrender. It signified repositioning. Field commanders along the threatened sector reported the American thrust as deeper than anticipated, but not uncontrollable. Communications were strained, yet not severed. Orders moved rearward as rapidly as units retreated. The immediate objective was simple by time. Rear guards were instructed to delay, not defeat. Anti-tank guns were repositioned to choke narrow roads. Bridges were destroyed where feasible. Infantry detachments were told to fight briefly, then withdraw before the goal shifted from holding territory to slowing tempo. German doctrine emphasized elasticity under stress. When frontal resistance failed, commanders were trained to yield ground strategically, trading space for cohesion. The intention was to draw advancing forces into extended positions where counterattack could be organized against exposed flanks. Patton's speed, while impressive, had created precisely such exposure. The protrusion extending east offered a tempting target if sufficient armored reserves could be assembled. Panzer units that had avoided immediate destruction during the breakthrough were redirected toward the sides of the American advance. Rail movement was limited, but motorized redeployment remained possible in sectors not yet dominated by Allied air power. German officers recognized that confronting the spearhead directly would be costly. Instead, they focused on striking its shoulders-cutting supply routes, isolating forward elements, and forcing a halt through attrition rather than decisive engagement. Artillery concentrations began to appear along key crossroads feeding Third Army's supply lines. Mortar units targeted refueling points and temporary depots. Small armored detachments probed lightly secured villages behind the front, seeking disruption rather than victory. Each engagement was minor in scale, yet collectively they signaled adaptation. The Germans had shifted from defensive paralysis to calculated resistance. The psychological dimension evolved as well. Early reports of American speed had induced uncertainty among German troops. That uncertainty hardened into resolve once command channels stabilized. Soldiers were reminded that Allied advances earlier in the war had stalled when stretched too thin. The narrative within German ranks reframed the breakthrough as overextension rather than dominance. If the Americans could be slowed, the protrusion might become their weakness. Weather and terrain offered additional tools. Forested regions east of the breakthrough corridor provided concealment for regrouping forces. River lines presented natural defensive anchors. German engineers prepared demolition charges on secondary crossings, forcing American units to rely on limited intact bridges. Each destroyed crossing added delay, and delay eroded momentum. German intelligence also assessed the political context of coalition warfare. A deep American thrust unsupported by parallel advances elsewhere might strain Allied coordination. If British and American formations became misaligned, opportunities for localized counteroffensives would expand. German commanders did not need to achieve strategic reversal immediately. They needed to restore balance long enough to exploit any fissures in Allied synchronization. Counter-adaptation did not reverse the breakthrough overnight. The initial shock had cost Germany valuable ground, yet within the first day of consolidation, Signs of organized resistance increased. American reconnaissance units reported more cohesive defensive fire. Anti-tank positions were camouflaged and repositioned after limited engagements. Local counterattacks tested the resilience of forward elements. The fundamental contrast shifted. In the first 48 hours, Patton dictated tempo. After that window, tempo became contested. Every mile forward required greater coordination. Every supply convoy demanded heavier escort. Momentum remained, but it was no longer effortless. The Germans had regained agency. This transition marked a critical inflection point. Breakthroughs rarely conclude campaigns on their own. They initiate new phases of contest. German counter-adaptation did not negate Patton's achievement, but it complicated its continuation. The exposed flanks identified at Supreme Headquarters were no longer theoretical vulnerabilities. They were active points of friction. War rewards those who adapt faster than their opponent. Patton had exploited collapse with relentless motion. Now German command attempted to transform that motion into liability. The spear had pierced deep, but its edges were under pressure. Whether the breakthrough would mature into strategic advantage depended on which side could recalibrate more effectively in the hours that followed. The turning point did not arrive as a dramatic reversal. It emerged gradually, through pressure applied against the edges of Patton's advance. German countermaneuvers, though limited in scale, began testing the integrity of the protrusion. Supply convoys encountered organized resistance rather than scattered stragglers. Reconnaissance patrols reported armored elements repositioning along secondary roads. The surge had forced reaction. Now reaction sought to contain it. The question was whether a containment would harden into counterstroke. The most dangerous moment came not at the tip of the spear, but along its shoulders. German units probing the flanks identified lightly secured corridors connecting forward armor to rear supply hubs. Anti-tank guns and mobile infantry detachments harassed refueling sites and temporary depots. Artillery shells fell closer to the arteries sustaining Third Army's movement. The initial shock advantage had faded. The contest shifted from speed to coordination. Patton responded with characteristic decisiveness, but the response required more than aggression. Air support was redirected to suppress concentrations forming along vulnerable sectors. Fighter bombers that had previously roamed ahead of the spearhead were tasked with interdiction along flanks and supply routes. Artillery units repositioned to create overlapping fire zones, guarding critical junctions. The spear could not remain thin. It had to thicken. At corps and division headquarters, coordination intensified. Infantry, previously trailing armored columns, were ordered to secure towns bypassed during the surge. Engineers fortified key crossings and constructed defensive works around depots. Tank destroyer units were redistributed to sectors most likely to experience counterattack. The tempo remained aggressive, but it was now reinforced. The breakthrough began transforming from protrusion into structured advance. German commanders attempted localized strikes where terrain favored concealment. Forested patches and river bends offered opportunities for surprise engagement. In several encounters, American forward elements were forced into sharp defensive actions before resuming movement. These engagements did not halt the advance entirely, but they signaled that collapse had ended. Resistance was organized and purposeful. Eisenhower's role during this phase was less visible, but equally decisive. Rather than publicly reprimanding Patton or imposing abrupt restrictions, he facilitated integration. Adjacent formations were encouraged to accelerate where possible, narrowing the disparity between sectors. Supply allocations were recalibrated to sustain the new operational depth. Reinforcement units were directed toward vulnerable corridors. The breakthrough was no longer treated as deviation. It was absorbed into the broader campaign. The confrontation, therefore, unfolded without collapse on either side. German efforts to constrict the salient achieved friction, but not isolation. American countermeasures stabilized flanks before vulnerabilities could mature into crisis. Momentum slowed slightly, but it did not reverse. The spear did not shatter. It thickened under pressure. Crucially, the coordination between air power, artillery, and armored maneuver matured during this period. Where early movement relied heavily on shock and speed, later progress depended on synchronized firepower. Artillery barrages preceded advances into suspected defensive clusters. Air reconnaissance identified concentrations before they could fully deploy. Infantry secured ground immediately after armor passed through, preventing rear area instability. The breakthrough evolved from improvisation into structured exploitation. Casualties increased modestly compared to the first 48 hours, a reminder that friction had returned to the battlefield. Yet the feared catastrophic counterstroke never materialized. German forces lacked sufficient concentration to sever the extended lines before reinforcement measures took effect. Their adaptation had imposed cost, but not reversal. The episode revealed a subtle equilibrium. Patton's philosophy of relentless motion had cracked the front. Eisenhower's insistence on integration prevented that crack from becoming fracture. The confrontation between initiative and structure did not end in dramatic rebuke. It resolved in recalibration. In operational terms, the breakthrough survived because it was reinforced before vulnerability matured into disaster. The exposed shoulders were secured. Supply lines were hardened. Adjacent armies adjusted their pace. What might have become a dangerous overreach instead became an accelerated phase of the Allied advance. The confrontation without collapse demonstrated a broader truth about modern warfare. Momentum alone wins no campaign, nor does a rigid adherence to plan. Victory emerges when bold action is followed by disciplined consolidation. Patton's surge forced adaptation. Eisenhower ensured that adaptation preserved unity. Together, though not without tension, they converted a risky divergence into sustained advantage. Momentum is measured in miles on a map. Cost is measured in names that never reach one. For the men inside Patton's armored columns, the 48-hour surge was not a doctrinal debate. It was exhaustion layered over adrenaline. Drivers gripped steering controls through the night, headlights dimmed, engines vibrating beneath them without pause. Infantry clung to the hulls of tanks or rode in open trucks, swallowing dust and diesel fumes. Meals were eaten cold. When time allowed, sleep became a calculation, minutes stolen beside a road before movement resumed. Speed protected them, but it also consumed them. Casualty reports during the surge were lower than planners had feared, yet they were not insignificant. German rearguards fought hard in narrow villages and along river crossings. A concealed anti-tank gun could end an advance in seconds. A misjudged turn into a constricted street could expose an entire column. The myth of effortless breakthrough dissolved quickly for those closest to the fire. Every rapid gain required someone to step into danger first. Medical units struggled to keep pace. Field hospitals relocated repeatedly as the front shifted east. Wounded soldiers were evacuated over increasingly long supply routes. The faster the advance, the farther the injured had to travel for sustained care. For many, survival depended not only on battlefield medicine, but on the fragile integrity of stretched logistics. Mechanical strain mirrored human fatigue. Tank crews worked alongside maintenance teams during brief halts, tightening bolts, replacing worn track segments, inspecting engines stressed by relentless motion. Machines, like men, were operating beyond design comfort. A broken transmission in open terrain could be repaired. A breakdown under artillery threat required improvisation under fire. Victory demanded constant repair. Back at higher headquarters, the political consequences of Patton's acceleration became more visible. British commanders expressed restrained concern that American speed risked overshadowing coordinated operations elsewhere along the front. Newspapers back home celebrated rapid gains, amplifying the image of decisive American maneuver. Public narratives rarely mentioned coalition, synchronization, or logistical fragility. They praised boldness. Such praise carried weight. Command reputations shifted with every headline. Patton's image as an aggressive battlefield commander strengthened. Eisenhower's role as stabilizing architect of coalition warfare remained less visible but more consequential. Within military circles, debates intensified. Was the breakthrough proof that aggressive exploitation should override cautious planning? Or was it evidence that success required immediate structural integration to avoid disaster? The men on the ground rarely engaged in such abstractions. Their concerns were immediate: securing crossroads, clearing villages, guarding supply convoys. Yet even among them, perception evolved. Soldiers sensed they were part of a dramatic shift. Rapid advances fueled confidence. Confidence, however, also increased exposure. A sense of invulnerability could invite miscalculation. Commanders had to temper enthusiasm with discipline. German civilians encountered during the advance reflected another dimension of costs. Towns changed hands quickly, but fear lingered. Infrastructure damaged by retreating forces complicated relief efforts. Bridges destroyed by necessity disrupted local life, as well as military movement. Every breakthrough reshaped more than battle lines. It altered daily existence for populations caught between armies. Within the coalition itself, the surge required delicate communication. Eisenhower maintained steady dialogue with British leadership, ensuring that accelerated American movement did not fracture unity. Strategic patience remained essential even amid rapid progress. The Allied campaign's legitimacy depended on shared success, not unilateral spectacle. The human costs also included psychological strain, rapid operations, compressed decision-making cycles. Junior officers were forced to interpret incomplete intelligence and act decisively. Mistakes were magnified by tempo. Fatigue eroded clarity. The line between initiative and overreach narrowed under pressure. When the breakthrough stabilized and integration measures took hold, relief mingled with reflection. The spear had not shattered. The feared counterstroke had not materialized in catastrophic form, yet the surge left scars-damaged vehicles, exhausted formations, and fallen soldiers whose names were recorded quietly in after-action summaries. Momentum had produced strategic opportunity. It had also demanded relentless sacrifice. The political narrative would remember the speed. The maps would show the depth of penetration. But those who lived through it understood that every mile carried weight. The 48-hour breakthrough reshaped reputations and doctrine. Yet its most immediate legacy was borne by men who drove, repaired, fought, and endured without pause. Victory, even when swift, is never free. It is accumulated in effort, sustained in discipline, and remembered in silence long after the arrows on the map fade. When the dust settled and the front stabilized, the 48-hour breakthrough no longer appeared as an anomaly. It became a case study, not because it defied the plan, but because it forced the plan to evolve. Military history often simplifies tension into rivalry. Eisenhower, the cautious architect; Patton, the relentless spear. The reality was more complex. The breakthrough did not succeed solely because Patton moved fast, nor did it endure solely because Eisenhower insisted on structure. It survived because friction between initiative and discipline produced adaptation before disaster could intervene. In the weeks that followed, Allied operational doctrine quietly absorbed the lessons of those 48 hours. Plans remained essential, but flexibility within them gained renewed emphasis. Commanders were encouraged to exploit genuine collapse, yet required to secure flanks with equal urgency. Speed was validated as a weapon. Sustainability was reaffirmed as its guardrail. The breakthrough demonstrated that modern mechanized warfare operates in cycles of compression and stabilization. First, tempo overwhelms. Then structure reinforces. An advance that remains only momentum eventually exhausts itself. An advance that remains only cautious forfeits opportunity. A successful campaign balances both. Eisenhower's reaction measured, not punitive. Decisive in shaping that balance. He did not publicly rebuke Patton, nor did he abandon theater-wide coordination in favor of spectacle. Instead, he integrated the surge into the broader coalition framework. Adjacent armies accelerated where possible. Supply allocations shifted. Air support coverage extended. What began as divergence became alignment. Patton, for his part, did not abandon his creed. He continued to push aggressively whenever opportunity emerged. But the 48-hour surge reinforced the truth. Even he understood. Velocity requires reinforcement. When counter-adaptation began along the flanks, Third Army thickened its advance rather than relying solely on shock. Artillery coordination increased. Infantry secured bypassed ground more deliberately. The spear learned to grow shoulders. This synthesis initiative within structure would define Allied operations for the remainder of the campaign in Western Europe. River crossings were executed with both bold thrusts and secured corridors. Breakthroughs were followed immediately by consolidation measures. Air power was treated not only as an offensive hammer but as a stabilizing shield for exposed sectors. Beyond the immediate campaign, the episode influenced the broader understanding of coalition warfare. Multinational operations require predictability, yet they must remain adaptable. No plan survives. First contact unchanged. The question is not whether deviation will occur, but whether command systems can absorb deviation without fracture. The 48-hour breakthrough revealed that modern command effectiveness depends less on rigid control and more on controlled elasticity. Eisenhower's authority was not weakened by Patton's surge. It was tested. His response-calibrated integration rather than reactionary restraint strengthened the coalition. Patton's aggressiveness was not diminished. It was contextualized within a larger operational fabric. In professional military education after the war, similar episodes were analyzed as examples of dynamic equilibrium. A commander at the tactical edge must recognize opportunity and act. A commander at theater level must anticipate systemic consequences and adjust accordingly. Success emerges not from eliminating tension, but from managing it. There is a final irony in the phrase that framed this episode. That wasn't the plan. It suggests failure to adhere, yet in reality, it signaled awareness that war is never static. Plans provide direction. Initiative provides momentum. Friction provides clarity. The 48-hour breakthrough did not undermine Allied strategy. It refined it. It exposed vulnerabilities quickly enough to correct them. It proved that bold action and disciplined oversight are not opposites. They are interdependent forces within modern warfare. In the end, the spear did not snap. It became part of the larger advance. And that is the enduring lesson. Victory is rarely the triumph of one philosophy over another. It is the alignment of tension into strength, a moment when motion and structure, risk and restraint fuse into something more durable than either alone. That was not the plan. It became the doctrine into irreversible advantage.